Thomas Kuhn, and
Yeah.
his groundbreaking book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. So Kuhn, he takes this hard look at the often messy reality of scientific practice,
Yeah.
right? And he argues it's not nearly as neat and tidy as we often like to pretend it is.
Absolutely. One of Kuhn's key arguments is that scientists, for all their emphasis on objectivity, they don't actually exist in a vacuum, right? They're part of a community.
Sure.
And that community inevitably influences how they see the world. This is where Kuhn introduces his very famous, or infamous, depending on who you talk to, concept of paradigms.
Okay.
So think of a paradigm as a framework of thought, a set of shared methods, definitions, assumptions even, that shape how a scientific community interprets the world. It's like the water that scientists swim in. They're often so immersed in it that they don't even realize it's there, I think. Kuhn argues that scientists are often so entrenched in their paradigms that they actually resist evidence that contradicts their worldview.
Hold on. You're saying that instead of being open to being proven wrong, they try to cram new information into their existing theories, even if it doesn't quite fit.
You got it. And Kuhn calls this normal science.
Normal science.
Instead of rocking the boat, most scientists, he argues, are mainly focused on confirming what they already believe. He even goes so far as to suggest that those really major shifts in scientific thinking, the revolutions that kind of change everything, they aren't always driven by just logic and evidence alone.
Well, what else is there? What else would drive such a massive shift?
Well, Kuhn suggests they're often more like, and this might sound strange, but he says they're more like religious conversions.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that switching from one scientific theory to another is like a religious experience? That seems like a pretty bold claim.
It is a bold claim, but Kuhn argues that these shifts are often driven by things like faith in a new idea, social pressure from others in the field, even just straight-up personality clashes within the scientific community. It's not always this neat and tidy process of scientists saying, oh, we've got new evidence, time to change our minds. Sometimes it's more, my entire world just got flipped upside down and I need to find a new tribe that sees things the way I do now.
Wow. Okay, so if Kuhn is right about all of this, does this mean that the idea of progress in science is an illusion? Are we really just replacing one subjective viewpoint with another with no real way to say which one is actually better?
That's a really important question, and it gets to the heart of what this lecture is really grappling with. If science isn't really about objective truth, in this capital T truth kind of way, then where does that leave it? Is it really so different from myth, religion, even witchcraft, as some philosophers have suggested?
If that's the case, then what does that mean for all those claims about Western science being superior to other cultural traditions? Whose reality are we really living in here? This is getting pretty deep.
It is heavy stuff, and I think it's really important for us to remember here that both Popper and Kuhn, they're offering us kind of two different lenses through which to view science, right?
Okay.
It's not about saying that one is right and one is wrong, but rather just acknowledging that they offer these really different ways of understanding how science works and what it all means.
And that's what good philosophy should do, right? It should push us to think critically and question our assumptions.
As
Speaking of which, I would love to maybe delve a little deeper into Kuhn's idea of normal science. Is he really suggesting that most scientists are just going through the motions, simply trying to confirm what they already believe?
I think it's safe to say that Kuhn's description of normal science isn't always the most flattering. He argues that a lot of scientific work, while important, isn't really about making those big, groundbreaking discoveries or challenging those established theories. Instead, he calls it mop-up work.
Mop-up work. That doesn't sound very exciting.
No, but don't let the term fool you, because it's absolutely essential.
Okay.
Think of it as filling in the gaps, refining those existing theories, making sure that all the pieces of the paradigm, so to speak, really fit together. It might not be glamorous, but it's the foundation upon which those big eureka moments can actually happen.
Okay, so no disrespect to the mop-up crew out there. But I can see why Kuhn might call that normal. It's the day-to-day work of science. It's not the headline-grabbing breakthroughs.
Exactly. And Kuhn argues that this focus on normal science is actually almost built into the way that scientists are trained.
You mean it's like being indoctrinated into a particular way of thinking?
Kuhn certainly doesn't shy away from strong language like that. He argues that basically from the moment a student enters into a scientific field, They are taught to see the world through the lens of that prevailing paradigm. They learn the accepted methods, they learn the key definitions, they learn those unspoken assumptions that everybody takes for granted.
So by the time they're actually doing research, they're already operating within a pretty narrow box.
That's right.
Does he think that's a bad thing?
I think Kuhn recognizes that having this shared paradigm, while potentially limiting, is also what allows for progress within that paradigm.
Okay.
It gives them a common language, it gives them a shared set of tools, it gives them that roadmap for research. But it can also make it very difficult to see beyond the edges of that box.
Right.
To even imagine that there might be other possibilities out there.
Which brings us back, I think, to those paradigm shifts. Those revolutions that Kuhn said are more like conversions than rational decisions, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like you can't just reason your way out of a paradigm. You need to have some kind of experience that shakes you to your core, something that forces you to rebuild your understanding of the world from the ground up.
And those experiences are rarely neat and tidy.
Right.
They are often messy, they're unpredictable, and they're driven as much by human emotions and social dynamics as they are by logic.
Okay, so we've got these paradigms. They shape how scientists see the world. But Kuhn also uses this term incommensurable to describe how different paradigms relate to each other.
What he basically means by incommensurable is that you can't really directly compare two things because they're being judged by such different standards.
So it's not even that scientists using different paradigms just disagree about the answers.
Yeah.
They're actually disagreeing about what questions to ask in the first place.
Precisely. It's like they're speaking different languages, even though they're both supposedly talking about the same natural world.
Right.
And that, I think, makes these paradigm shifts even more complex and more challenging because it's not just presenting new evidence, it's about getting people to shift their entire worldview, to see the world in this completely new light.
I think I'm starting to see why Kuhn uses these political and religious metaphors.
Sure.
Because this kind of fundamental shift in thinking does seem more like a conversion experience than a logical debate.
Absolutely.
There's this element of almost like faith involved in embracing a new paradigm.
Yeah, and you can imagine not everyone was thrilled with Kuhn's ideas. He had, and still has, plenty of critics who accuse him of being too subjective, too relativistic. Some would even say anti-science.
I can see how his ideas could be controversial because if we really follow them to their logical conclusion, doesn't that mean that science is just a collection of stories we tell ourselves about the world?
Yeah.
With no real way to know which story is actually the true one.
If we accept Kuhn's argument that there is no objective yardstick for measuring progress in science,
Right.
then suddenly Western science doesn't seem quite as superior to other ways of knowing, does it?
It really makes you question everything, doesn't it? If science is not this ultimate arbiter of truth, then where does that leave us?
That's exactly what the lecture explores. And it does so in a kind of interesting way because it brings up myth, religion, magic, witchcraft, all these things that modern science has historically really sought to distance itself from.
Of course.
Or even discredit entirely. But if we consider that maybe all knowledge is ultimately shaped by these paradigms, by our individual and collective kind of frameworks of understanding,
Right.
then who are we to say that one paradigm is inherently better than another?
So we're back to those fundamental questions. Whose reality are we living in? And if it's all just paradigms, is science even really about objective truth?
Yeah.
Or is it just another story that we tell ourselves about the world?
Those are questions that I think are as relevant today as they were back in the 1960s. In fact, I'd argue they're even more relevant now as we grapple with issues like climate change, artificial intelligence, even the very nature of consciousness, right? Issues where our existing paradigms often seem to be failing us.
I keep thinking about Kuhn's point about how scientists are trained to see the world through the lens of that prevailing paradigm.
Yeah.
That really stood out to me.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, how does that impact the way we teach science?
Yeah.
How we communicate scientific findings to the public? Even how we view this whole idea of scientific authority?
It's such a crucial point because if most scientists are, at least initially, working within the confines of a particular paradigm,
Right.
how does that impact their research? How does that impact their conclusions, even their ability to recognize alternative viewpoints?
Yeah, it's almost as if the very framework that allows for progress within a paradigm can also make it difficult to see, like, the limitations of that paradigm.
Right.
Like, you're so focused on working within the system that you don't even realize that there might be a completely different system out there.
Exactly. And this isn't just a challenge for scientists either, right? If we as non-scientists are trying to understand these really complex issues, how do we navigate this whole landscape of competing paradigms?
We're all susceptible to seeing the world through a particular lens.
Absolutely. And the lecture, I think, really drives home the point that those paradigm shifts, right? There's moments when we're actually forced to re-examine those fundamental assumptions about the world can be incredibly challenging. It's like that moment when you finally see the hidden image and the optical illusion, right? It changes your whole perception, but it can also be disorienting, even a little unsettling.
And it wasn't easy to let go of those previous beliefs, but it was also just incredibly exhilarating to realize that my understanding of the world could expand in such a profound way.
That's the thing about knowledge, isn't it? It has this power to challenge our assumptions, to force us to confront our own biases, to even make us question our place in the universe. But that's also what makes it so valuable, right? The more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. And I think that opens up a whole world of possibilities.
So where does that leave us at the end of all this? If, as Kuhn suggests, we're not necessarily marching towards some grand, objective, capital T truth,
Right.
what are we even supposed to do with this information?
Not just blindly accepting things at face value, but curious enough to dig a little deeper to ask why.
So embrace the uncertainty.
Yeah.
Stay curious. Never stop asking those tough questions.
Precisely. And who knows? Along the way, we might even experience a paradigm shift or two of our own.
And for those of you listening, remember, the conversation doesn't have to end here. And in fact, this lecture that we've been talking about concludes with this very direct challenge, which is, are you truly open to having your most cherished beliefs challenged? Or are you perhaps unconsciously clinging to a particular paradigm that might be preventing you from seeing the bigger picture?